Our family's fake illness code words helped my sister escape her abusive husband. When I was 12 and my sister Vanessa was 9, our mother invented what she called the emergency excuse system. Mom was a nurse who worked unpredictable shifts at County General, and Dad traveled constantly for his sales job. We were latchkey kids who spent a lot of time at friends' houses or with babysitters, and Mom worried about us getting stuck in situations where we felt uncomfortable but didn't know how to leave politely. She'd heard too many stories from patients about kids who'd been molested by family friends or hurt by bullies because they didn't want to be rude by calling their parents to pick them up early. The system was simple but specific. If either of us called or texted saying we had a headache, that meant we were bored and wanted to come home, but everything was fine. If we said we had a stomachache, that meant we felt uncomfortable or awkward, but not in danger. But if we said we had the blue flu, that was code red. Blue flu meant we were scared, we felt unsafe, we needed extraction immediately with no questions asked. Mom promised that if we ever used blue flu, she'd drop everything and come get us within 30 minutes, no matter what. She wouldn't ask why until we were home and safe. She wouldn't be mad. She wouldn't make us explain ourselves to whoever we were with. We practiced it religiously for years. Mom would quiz us randomly over breakfast. What do you say if you're at a sleepover and the older brother is making you uncomfortable? Vanessa would immediately respond, I'd text that I have the blue flu. Dad got involved too, drilling us on scenarios during long car rides. What if a coach asked you to stay after practice alone? What if an adult offered you a ride home and something felt wrong? What if a friend's parent was drinking and wanted to drive you somewhere? Blue flu, blue flu, blue flu. The phrase became so embedded in our family vocabulary that we started using it as shorthand for any situation that felt dangerous or wrong. Vanessa used it 3 times growing up. Once when she was 10, and a friend's teenage cousin kept trying to get her alone in the basement. Once when she was 13, and got invited to a party where kids were doing drugs. Once when she was 16, and her date tried to pressure her into going to a hotel instead of the movie they'd planned. Each time, Mom or Dad showed up within the promised 30 minutes. No questions asked in front of others, full debriefing once we were safe at home. The system worked perfectly because it gave us power to leave situations without having to articulate why or defend our instincts to people who might dismiss our fears. By the time Vanessa was 28 and I was 31, we'd mostly forgotten about the emergency excuse system. It had become one of those childhood things we'd joke about occasionally when reminiscing about Mom's overprotective parenting. Vanessa had been married to Grant Holloway for 3 years, and from the outside, everything looked perfect. He was a corporate attorney at a prestigious firm. They had a beautiful house in an expensive suburb. Vanessa had quit her job as a graphic designer to focus on starting a family. Grant was charming and successful, the kind of guy who remembered everyone's names at parties and always picked up the check at restaurants. I'd never particularly liked Grant, but I couldn't articulate why. He was perfectly polite to me, always asked about my work as a high school history teacher, sent thoughtful gifts on birthdays, but something about him felt performative, like he was always aware of his audience and adjusting his behavior accordingly. Vanessa seemed happy, though, posting photos on social media of their vacation to Italy and their remodeled kitchen. When I'd see them at family dinners, Grant would have his arm around her waist, finishing her sentences, laughing at her jokes. Mom and Dad loved him, thrilled that Vanessa had found someone stable and financially secure. The first text came on a Friday evening in September. I was grading papers at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. Hey, not feeling great. Think I might have the blue flu. Need to rest this weekend. I stared at the screen, my brain taking several seconds to process what I was reading. Blue flu. The phrase we hadn't used in over a decade. The emergency code that meant danger, fear, immediate help needed. I called her immediately, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times with the same result. I texted back, Are you okay? Do you need me to come over? The response came fast. Can't talk now. Grant home. We'll explain later. Just needed you to know. My hands started shaking as I reread the messages. She'd used the code deliberately, making sure I understood this wasn't a casual reference to childhood memories. She was telling me she was in danger, but she couldn't communicate freely because Grant was monitoring her. I wanted to drive to their house immediately, but something stopped me. If Vanessa was in a situation where she couldn't speak freely, showing up unannounced might make things worse. I called Mom instead. She answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful until I told her about the text. The silence on her end stretched for several long seconds. Then she said in her nurse voice, the calm, professional tone she used in emergencies, When did you get this message? Is she responding to you now? I walked her through the entire exchange while she listened without interrupting. When I finished, Mom said, Grant's been isolating her. I've noticed it for months, but convinced myself I was imagining things. She stopped coming to family dinners as frequently. Always has an excuse. He answers her phone sometimes when I call. Mom and I made a plan. We'd give Vanessa space for the weekend since she'd indicated Grant was home and she couldn't talk freely. But Monday morning, Mom would call Vanessa's phone repeatedly until she answered. If Grant answered instead, Mom would insist on speaking to Vanessa directly, using the excuse of a family medical issue that required immediate discussion. We agreed not to tell Dad yet because he'd probably drive over there and confront Grant, which could escalate a dangerous situation. Mom promised to call me the moment she made contact with Vanessa. That weekend was torture. I kept checking my phone every 10 minutes, hoping for another message from Vanessa. Nothing came. I drove past their house on Saturday afternoon, telling myself I was just running errands in that direction. Grant's Mercedes was in the driveway, and I could see him through the front window, sitting on the couch watching television. No sign of Vanessa. I wanted to knock on the door, demand to see my sister, but I remembered Mom's warning. We needed to be strategic, not reactive. If Grant was abusive, barging in could put Vanessa in more danger. Monday morning, Mom called me at 7. I spoke to her. Grant answered first and tried to tell me she was sleeping, but I insisted it was urgent. When Vanessa got on the phone, she sounded terrified. She couldn't talk freely because he was listening, but she confirmed she's not okay. She said she's been having the blue flu on and off for weeks. She needs help getting out. Mom's voice was steady, but I could hear the rage underneath. We need to get her away from him today, before he realizes we know something is wrong. I called in sick to work and drove to Mom's house. We spent an hour planning logistics like we were coordinating a military operation. The challenge was that Grant controlled Vanessa's access to their shared bank accounts. Her phone was probably monitored, and she didn't have a car of her own anymore since Grant had convinced her she didn't need one when she stopped working. We needed to extract her when Grant wasn't home, but we didn't know his schedule. Mom suggested we use a medical emergency as cover, something that would give Vanessa a legitimate reason to leave the house that Grant couldn't argue with. Mom called Vanessa's phone at 9:30. Grant answered again, his voice smooth and friendly. "Hey, Carol. Vanessa's actually not feeling well today. I think she needs to rest." Mom didn't miss a beat. "I need to speak with her right now, Grant. It's about test results from her doctor's appointment last month. It's urgent and confidential medical information." There was a pause. Then Grant said in a slightly cooler tone, "I'm her husband. You can tell me." Mom's voice went sharp. "HIPAA regulations prevent me from discussing medical information with anyone except the patient. Put Vanessa on the phone now." When Vanessa came on the line, Mom launched into a prepared speech about abnormal test results that required immediate follow-up testing at County General. She said Vanessa needed to come to the hospital within the next 2 hours for urgent blood work and imaging. She made it sound serious, but not life-threatening, treatable, but requiring immediate attention. I could hear Grant in the background asking what was wrong, and Vanessa explaining in a shaky voice that she needed to go to the hospital for tests. Mom offered to pick her up, but Grant insisted he'd drive her. That wasn't part of our plan. We'd expected Vanessa to be able to leave alone, meeting Mom at the hospital where we'd have the advantage of a public setting with security. But Grant coming meant he'd maintain control of the situation. Mom handled it smoothly, saying she'd meet them at the emergency entrance and walk them through the process since she worked there and could expedite things. She gave them a specific time to arrive, 45 minutes from now, which would give us time to set things up on our end. Mom called hospital security and explained that a domestic violence victim was arriving shortly, that the husband was potentially dangerous and couldn't be allowed into the examination areas. She contacted a social worker she knew who specialized in abuse cases. She alerted the charge nurse on duty to be prepared for a complex situation. By the time Grant's Mercedes pulled up to the emergency entrance with Vanessa in the passenger seat, we had a team ready. Mom met them at the door with a wheelchair, telling Grant that hospital protocol required patients to be wheeled in for liability reasons. She started pushing Vanessa toward the entrance while explaining to Grant where he should park and which waiting room to go to. I watched from inside the emergency room doors, my heart pounding. Grant hesitated, clearly suspicious, but unable to articulate a reason to refuse without looking controlling in a public setting. He said he'd come with Vanessa, but Mom cut him off firmly. "The triage area is patients only. You'll need to wait in the family area. Once we get her checked in and determine what tests are needed, someone will update you." Grant's expression hardened for a moment, and I saw what Vanessa must have been seeing for months. Pure rage barely contained behind a civilized mask, but he was too image-conscious to make a scene in public, so he nodded stiffly and walked toward the parking garage. The moment Vanessa was through the doors, Mom wheeled her past the triage desk and into a private examination room. The social worker, a woman named Rita Calhoun, was already waiting. Rita closed the door and introduced herself, explaining that Vanessa was safe, that this room was secure, that no one would be allowed in without her permission. Vanessa started crying immediately, the kind of deep sobs that come from months of suppressed terror. Mom held her while Rita and I stood by, giving them space but ready to help. When Vanessa could speak, the story came out in fragments. Grant had started getting controlling about 6 months after they married, small things at first. Checking her phone, asking detailed questions about where she'd been and who she'd talked to. She'd thought it was just insecurity, something they could work through with communication. Then he'd convinced her to quit her job, saying his salary was enough and she should focus on preparing for a baby. Without her own income, Vanessa had become completely financially dependent on Grant within a year of marriage. The isolation had escalated gradually. Grant would start fights before family gatherings, making Vanessa late or too upset to go. He'd monopolize her time on weekends, planning activities that prevented her from seeing friends. He'd criticize her family to her face, calling us poor and unsophisticated, saying she was better than us now that she'd married into money. When Vanessa pushed back, He'd give her the silent treatment for days, making her feel crazy and desperate for his approval. She found herself walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring his moods, trying to prevent explosions she couldn't predict. The physical abuse had started 3 months ago. Grant had shoved her during an argument about her wanting to volunteer at an animal shelter, claiming she was trying to meet other men. She'd fallen and hit her head on a table corner, requiring 6 stitches that Grant had insisted they tell the emergency room was from a fall in the shower. After that, he'd apologized profusely, cried, promised it would never happen again, blamed stress at work. Vanessa had wanted to believe him because accepting the truth meant admitting her marriage was dangerous, but it had happened again and again. Grant had slapped her for burning dinner, punched her in the stomach for checking her phone when he was talking, twisted her arm behind her back until something popped when she'd suggested they visit our parents. He'd learned to hit her in places that didn't show, to time his violence for evenings when she had nowhere to go the next day. He'd taken control of her phone completely, reading all her messages, deleting contacts he didn't approve of, monitoring her location constantly. He'd hidden her driver's license and credit cards, making it impossible for her to leave even if she wanted to. The blue flu text had been sent during a brief window when Grant was in the shower and had left his phone downstairs. Vanessa had grabbed it, logged into her email on his device, and sent the message to me before deleting it from his sent folder and her inbox. She'd gambled that I'd remember the code, that I'd understand she needed help even though she couldn't say so explicitly. She'd been planning for weeks how to communicate without Grant discovering the attempt, and the emergency excuse system had been her answer. Our childhood code had given her a way to ask for help that looked innocuous if Grant had seen it. Rita explained what would happen next. Vanessa had options, but all of them required courage and commitment. She could file for a protection order immediately, which would require Grant to stay away from her and vacate their shared home. She could press charges for domestic violence, which would likely result in Grant's arrest. She could file for divorce with cause, which would impact the financial settlement. Or she could do all 3 simultaneously, hitting Grant with a coordinated legal strategy that would protect her while she rebuilt her life. Rita was honest that the process would be difficult, that Grant would fight back, that his resources as an attorney would make him a formidable opponent. Vanessa chose to do everything. She was done being afraid, done minimizing what Grant had done to her, done pretending this was a marriage that could be saved. Rita had a domestic violence advocate join us, who helped Vanessa file for an emergency protection order right there in the hospital. A judge approved it within 2 hours via teleconference, issuing a temporary order that barred Grant from contacting Vanessa or coming within 500 feet of her. Police were dispatched to serve Grant with the order at the hospital, where he was still waiting in the family area, growing increasingly agitated that he hadn't been updated about Vanessa's condition. I watched through a window as 2 officers approached Grant in the waiting room. He stood up with his charming smile, probably assuming they were there for some other reason. When they handed him the protection order paperwork, his expression shifted through confusion, rage, and finally calculation as he realized what was happening. He started arguing, his voice rising enough that I could hear it through the glass. He demanded to see Vanessa, insisted this was a misunderstanding, threatened to have the officers' badges for harassment. They remained calm and professional, explaining that he needed to leave the hospital immediately and that any attempt to contact Vanessa would result in his arrest. Grant's final words as the officers escorted him out were directed at Mom, who'd come to stand beside me at the window. He pointed at her and said loudly enough for everyone in the waiting room to hear, "This is your fault. You've poisoned her against me. I'll destroy all of you for this." Mom didn't flinch, just watched him leave with an expression of cold fury I'd never seen on her face before. She'd spent 3 decades as a trauma nurse, dealing with abusers and their victims. She knew exactly what Grant was, and she wasn't afraid of his threats. The protection order was just the first step. Over the next week, Vanessa moved into Mom and Dad's house with the help of a police escort to collect her essential belongings. Grant had already changed the locks on their house and canceled her credit cards, but the protection order gave her legal access to retrieve her personal property. Officers stood by while she packed clothes, documents, and a few sentimental items. Grant wasn't there, but he'd left evidence of his rage throughout the house. Broken picture frames, Vanessa's, clothes shredded and thrown in the trash, holes punched in walls. The officers documented everything with photos and added it to the case file. Vanessa filed formal charges for domestic violence assault, providing medical records from the night she'd needed stitches and from a follow-up visit where a doctor had documented suspicious bruising. She gave the police access to her medical history going back 3 years, and they found a pattern of injuries consistent with ongoing abuse. Grant was arrested at his law firm on a Thursday afternoon. Perp walked out in handcuffs in front of his colleagues and clients. The firm suspended him pending investigation, protecting their reputation over their employee. His bail was set at $50,000, which he posted within hours, but the protection order remained in effect. The divorce filing came next, with Vanessa seeking full dissolution with cause based on domestic violence. She requested half of their assets, temporary spousal support, and payment of her legal fees. Grant responded with his own filing, claiming Vanessa had abandoned the marriage and was making false accusations to gain financial advantage. He hired an aggressive divorce attorney who immediately began a campaign of legal harassment, filing motions to dismiss the protection order, demanding proof of abuse, questioning Vanessa's mental stability. The legal battle stretched over 6 months, with court dates and depositions and discovery fights. Grant used every tool available to him as an attorney, drawing out proceedings, filing frivolous motions, trying to exhaust Vanessa's resources and resolve. He violated the protection order twice, once by showing up at Mom and Dad's house late at night, and once by sending Vanessa threatening emails from a friend's account. Both violations resulted in his arrest, but he posted bail each time and continued his campaign of intimidation. Vanessa's attorney, a woman named Leslie Torres, who specialized in high-conflict divorces, filed for sanctions against Grant for his pattern of harassment. She compiled a file of his violations, his threatening communications, his attempts to manipulate the legal system. The judge assigned to their case was a woman who'd seen too many abusers use the courts as weapons, and she wasn't sympathetic to Grant's tactics. She issued a strongly worded order telling him to stop filing baseless motions and warning that continued harassment would result in contempt charges. The criminal case moved forward separately. Grant's attorney negotiated a plea deal where he'd admit to misdemeanor assault in exchange for dropping the felony charges. The prosecutor wasn't happy about it, but explained to Vanessa that taking the case to trial would require her to testify in detail about years of abuse, while Grant's defense attorney tried to discredit her. The plea would give Grant a criminal record and mandatory anger management counseling, plus 2 years probation. It wasn't the justice Vanessa deserved, but it was more than many domestic violence victims got. Grant's life unraveled in other ways. His law firm fired him after the criminal conviction, citing moral turpitude clauses in his employment contract. His reputation in the legal community was destroyed as word spread about the domestic violence allegations. Friends who'd socialized with them as a couple quietly distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with someone accused of abuse. Grant's parents, who'd initially defended their son, eventually saw the evidence and stopped supporting him financially. He was forced to sell their house to pay legal bills and his half of the divorce settlement. The final divorce hearing happened on a cold morning in March, 9 months after Vanessa had sent that blue flu text. Grant sat across the courtroom looking diminished, his expensive suit hanging looser on a frame that had lost weight from stress. Vanessa sat straight and calm, flanked by Leslie and surrounded by our family. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement that had been negotiated through their attorneys, split the assets evenly, awarded Vanessa temporary spousal support for 3 years, and granted the divorce. She also made the protection order permanent, meaning Grant could never contact Vanessa again without risking immediate arrest. As we left the courthouse, Grant tried one final manipulation. He called out to Vanessa, his voice breaking, saying he was sorry and he still loved her, and couldn't she give him another chance? Vanessa stopped and turned to face him, and I saw the woman she'd become over the past months. Stronger, clearer, no longer afraid. She said in a voice loud enough for everyone on the courthouse steps to hear, "You never loved me. You loved controlling me, and I'm never giving you that power again." Then she walked away, without looking back, surrounded by people who actually loved her. Vanessa rebuilt her life, piece by piece. She moved into a small apartment, got a job at a marketing agency, started therapy twice a week to process the trauma. She reconnected with friends Grant had isolated her from, joined a support group for domestic violence survivors, and began volunteering with an organization that helped other women escape abusive relationships. She cut her hair short, got a tattoo on her wrist that said "Blue Flu" in tiny letters as a reminder that she'd saved herself, that she'd found a way to ask for help when she couldn't speak freely. The emergency excuse system took on new meaning for our family. Mom started teaching it to her patients at the hospital, giving women and children a tool they could use to signal for help. She created wallet cards with the codes written as innocent-looking shopping lists or appointment reminders, something people could keep without arousing suspicion from their abusers. She partnered with a local domestic violence shelter to train advocates on how families could develop their own code systems, emphasizing that these tools needed to be established before crisis situations arose. I incorporated the concept into my teaching, running workshops for students about consent and healthy relationships, and recognizing warning signs of abuse. I taught them that everyone should have a way to signal for help when they can't speak freely, whether that's a code word with family or a gesture with friends. I told them Vanessa's story, with her permission, about how a silly childhood system had saved her life when nothing else could. The students listened with an intensity I rarely saw in teenagers, understanding instinctively that this information might one day be critical. Vanessa started dating again 2 years after the divorce, moving slowly and carefully with strong boundaries. She had a list of red flags she watched for, deal breakers she wouldn't compromise on. The first time she brought someone to family dinner, we all held our breath, watching to see if she'd chosen well. The guy was nervous, but genuine, respectful without being obsequious, interested in Vanessa's opinions without trying to dominate conversation. When he excused himself to use the bathroom, Vanessa caught my eye across the table and gave a small smile. No blue flu. Everything was fine. Mom kept the blue flu code active for all of us, even though Vanessa was the only one who'd needed it in crisis. She said you never knew when someone might feel uncomfortable or unsafe, when a simple phrase could provide an escape route from a dangerous situation. She updated the system periodically, adding new codes for new scenarios, making sure everyone in the extended family knew the current version. It became something we taught children as they got old enough to understand, passed down through generations like any other family tradition. Grant moved to another state after the divorce finalized, unable to handle living in a community where everyone knew what he'd done. Vanessa heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd remarried within a year, moving fast to find another woman he could control. She felt a pang of sympathy for whoever had fallen for his charm without knowing his history. She considered reaching out to warn the new wife, but decided against it after talking to her therapist. Some people had to learn hard lessons on their own, and Vanessa couldn't save everyone. She'd done the hardest thing by saving herself. 5 years after that first blue flu text, Vanessa stood in front of a room full of domestic violence survivors at a shelter downtown. She told them her story from beginning to end, holding nothing back about the fear and shame and isolation she'd experienced. She explained how a childhood code had given her a way to ask for help when every other avenue had been blocked. She taught them the emergency excuse system and encouraged them to create their own versions with people they trusted. She said the most important thing was having the code in place before you needed it, practicing it until it became automatic, trusting that the people who loved you would respond when you sent the signal. After the presentation, a young woman approached Vanessa with tears streaming down her face. She said she was currently in a controlling relationship and had been trying to figure out how to ask for help without her boyfriend discovering the attempt. Vanessa gave her a card with the blue flu code and Mom's phone number, telling her to memorize it and destroy the card. She said, "When you're ready, use these words, and someone will come get you. No questions asked until you're safe." The woman nodded, clutching the card like it was a lifeline, because that's exactly what it was. 3 years later, Vanessa got a letter forwarded through the shelter. It was from that young woman, now living safely in another city with a restraining order against her ex-boyfriend. She wrote that she'd used the blue flu code 6 months after meeting Vanessa, texting those words to a friend who'd been taught what they meant. Her friend had picked her up from a grocery store parking lot within 30 minutes, extracting her from a dangerous situation without alerting the boyfriend. She'd escaped and rebuilt her life, and wanted Vanessa to know that the emergency excuse system had saved 2 lives now, and probably would save more. She was teaching it to her younger sister and her co-workers, and anyone who'd listen. Vanessa keeps that letter in a frame on her desk, a reminder that survival has ripple effects, that teaching people to ask for help is as important as being willing to provide it. She married the man she'd brought to that family dinner years ago, a marriage built on trust and respect and freedom. They have 2 daughters who are learning the emergency excuse system as soon as they're old enough to understand sentences. Vanessa teaches them the same way Mom taught us, making it fun and playful while embedding the serious purpose underneath. Her daughters know that blue flu means come get me, I'm not safe, and they know their mother will drop everything to respond. Mom is 70 now, retired from nursing but still volunteering at the domestic violence shelter where Vanessa gives presentations. She's refined the emergency excuse system over decades, creating a handbook that's distributed to families across the state. She's trained hundreds of healthcare workers on how to help patients establish code words with their families, emphasizing that these systems need to be set up proactively rather than reactively. She says the most important thing she's learned in 40 years of trauma nursing is that people need permission to ask for help and tools to do so safely. Code words provide both. I'm a vice principal now, implementing school-wide programs about healthy relationships and consent and recognizing abuse. I tell Vanessa's story every year to incoming freshmen, explaining how a simple family code saved someone's life. I teach students to develop their own safety plans with trusted adults, to establish check-in systems with friends, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. I give them wallet cards with suggested code phrases they can use with family members. I make it clear that asking for help isn't weakness, it's survival. The emergency excuse system has become bigger than our family now, spreading through community networks and social services organizations. Mom's handbook has been translated into 12 languages and distributed nationally through domestic violence programs. Vanessa has been interviewed by news outlets about her experience, always emphasizing the practical tool that saved her rather than dwelling on the trauma. She wants people to walk away knowing they can create their own versions, adapted to their own families and circumstances, embedded in their own daily vocabulary. Grant died 3 years ago, a heart attack at 51. Vanessa got a notification because she was still listed as his emergency contact in some old paperwork. She felt nothing when she heard, not satisfaction or grief or relief. He'd become irrelevant to her life, a chapter closed and archived, no longer taking up emotional space. She didn't attend his funeral. She'd already mourned the man she'd thought she'd married, the person who'd never actually existed beneath Grant's carefully constructed facade. Sometimes I think about that Friday evening when I first received the blue flu text, how close we came to missing the signal. If Mom hadn't drilled those codes into us so thoroughly that they became second nature, if Vanessa hadn't remembered them in her moment of desperation, if Grant had been watching more carefully when she'd grabbed his phone, if I'd dismissed the text as a random reference to childhood memories instead of recognizing it as a cry for help, any of those small differences could have changed everything. But we'd practiced. We'd made the codes automatic. We'd promised each other we'd respond without hesitation. And when the moment came, the system worked exactly as designed. A silly childhood game became a lifeline, a A playful phrase became an escape route. A mother's overprotective invention became the thing that saved her daughter's life. That's why we still teach it, still drill it, still make sure every person in our extended family knows that blue flu means drop everything and come get me. Because you never know when someone you love will need a way to ask for help without speaking the words aloud, and having that tool already in place might be the difference between trapped and free. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.